The journey to Velen Prime took 3 days. Daniel spent all of it in a small cell aboard the Velanthe warship. The cell was not uncomfortable. It had a bed, a small table, and even a window that showed the stars passing by. But it was still a cell, and the energy barrier across the door reminded him of that every time he looked at it. They had taken him the moment they boarded the damaged cruiser. The Velanthe soldiers had found him kneeling beside the princess, his hands still pressed against her wound. They had not listened when Nathan tried to explain. They had not cared when Ryan protested. They had simply pulled Daniel away, locked restraints around his wrists, and dragged him to their ship. His crew had been released and sent back to the horizon's edge with a warning. Leave this sector immediately, and do not interfere. Daniel hoped Katie had been smart enough to follow that order. He hoped she had contacted Earth Command and told them what happened. He hoped someone back home knew where he was. But he also knew that it probably would not matter. He had touched Velanthe royalty. He had put his human hands on the sacred body of a princess. According to their law, there was only one punishment for that crime. On the 3rd day, the ship arrived at Velen Prime. Daniel watched through his window as the planet grew larger. It was a beautiful world, covered in swirling clouds of purple and gold. The cities below shimmered like collections of jewels, their towers reaching up toward the sky like fingers grasping at the stars. The guards came for him an hour later. They marched him through the ship, down a long ramp, and into a transport vehicle. The vehicle flew through the capital city, past buildings made of crystal and light, past crowds of Velanthe who stopped and stared at the human prisoner being taken to face justice. The throne room was the largest enclosed space Daniel had ever seen. The walls were made of living crystal that hummed with a frequency he could feel in his bones. Thousands of Velanthes stood in perfect rows, their tall, thin bodies wrapped in ceremonial silver robes. They all watched him with eyes that held no warmth, no sympathy, no understanding. Daniel was brought to the center of the room and forced to his knees. Guards stood on either side of him, their weapons ready. He looked up and saw the throne. It seemed to be made of pure light. It rose from the floor like a frozen flame, and sitting upon it was High Emperor Thalvaros. He was ancient, even by Velanthe standards. His silver hair fell past his shoulders, and his face was lined with the weight of centuries. His eyes were like polished metal, reflecting everything and revealing nothing. Behind the emperor stood his family, 4 children, all grown, all watching Daniel with different expressions. One of the princes looked at him with pure hatred. Another seemed merely curious. The 2 princesses kept their faces carefully blank. The princess he had saved was not among them. Daniel wondered if she was still recovering, or if they had kept her away on purpose. "Human," the emperor spoke. His voice filled the entire chamber without him raising it at all. "You stand accused of the highest crime against our people. You have touched sacred blood. You have contaminated the divine vessel of my daughter. What do you say?" Daniel took a breath. He had thought about this moment for 3 days. He had considered begging for mercy, explaining the situation, pleading ignorance of their laws. But in the end, he had decided to simply tell the truth. "She was dying," he said. His voice was calm and steady. "I am a commander in the Earth's Space Corps. When we received the distress signal from her ship, we responded. That is what we do. We help people who are in danger." The angry prince said, "You should have waited for our own rescue party. We were minutes away. She would have been saved by proper hands." Daniel replied, "Your rescue party was too far away. My medic said she had 4 minutes to live, maybe less. If I had not applied pressure to her wound while he worked, she would have been dead before your ships even docked." A murmur went through the crowd. The emperor raised his hand, and silence fell instantly. "Ignorance of our law is no excuse," Thalvaros said. Every species in the Galactic Concord knows the prohibition. You cannot claim you did not know. Daniel admitted, I knew. I knew your laws. I knew the punishment. But when I saw her lying there, bleeding out on the floor, I did not think about laws or punishments. I only thought about saving her life. And that, the prince said coldly, is precisely the problem with your species. You do not think. You act on impulse, on emotion, on primitive instinct. You have no respect for tradition, for sacred order, for anything beyond your own immediate desires. Daniel looked at the prince for a long moment. Then he looked at the emperor. I respect life, he said simply. I respect it more than I respect any law that would ask me to watch someone die when I could save them. If that makes me primitive, then I accept that judgment. But I will not apologize for what I did. The chamber erupted in angry voices. Guards moved closer, weapons raised. The prince was shouting something about immediate execution. The other nobles were arguing among themselves. And then a new voice cut through the chaos. Father. Everyone turned toward the entrance of the throne room. There, walking slowly between two attendants who supported her weakened body, was Princess Saylara. She was pale and clearly still recovering from her injuries. But she was alive. She was breathing. She was walking. She made her way down the long aisle between the rows of courtiers, and every eye in the chamber followed her. When she reached the center, she stopped and looked at Daniel. He saw something in her eyes that surprised him. Not anger, not disgust, not the cold superiority he had expected. It was curiosity, and perhaps something else, something like gratitude. She turned to face her father. This human saved my life, she said. Her voice was soft but clear. When our own ships were too far away, when I had only minutes left, he put his hands on my wound and kept me alive. His medic used human medicine to seal the damage. Without them, I would be dead. The law is clear, her brother said. His intentions do not matter. The act is what matters. Then I ask the court to consider a question, Saylara replied. She looked around at the assembled nobles, at the guards, at her family. Is the law greater than my life? Would you have preferred that I die pure, rather than live touched by human hands? No one answered. The emperor sat very still on his throne, his metal eyes fixed on his daughter. I would prefer that the law had never been broken, he finally said. But it was, and now we must decide what to do about it. Saylara turned back to look at Daniel. He met her gaze without flinching. Then I ask for time, she said. Before you pass judgment, I ask for time to investigate. There are questions I wish to answer. About our law, about its origins, about whether it truly serves our people as it was meant to. The emperor was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly he nodded. You have 1 week, he said. The human will remain in custody until then. 1 week, daughter. And then the law will have its answer. Daniel was taken back to his cell. But as the guards led him away, he looked over his shoulder and saw Saylara still standing in the center of that enormous room, watching him go. He did not know what she was planning. He did not know if it would save him or not. But for the first time since this began, he felt something other than resignation. He felt hope. Princess Saylara had always been the curious one in her family. While her brothers trained for war and politics, while her sister learned the arts of diplomacy and ceremony, Saylara spent her time in the great archives. She loved old books, ancient records, forgotten histories. Her father had always tolerated this strange hobby, thinking it harmless. Now that hobby would either save a life or end one. The imperial archives were located beneath the palace, carved into the living rock of the mountain upon which the throne room stood. Millions of records were stored there, dating back to the earliest days of the Volanthi civilization. Most of them had not been read in centuries. Some had not been touched in thousands of years. Saylara went there on the first day after the court hearing. Her attendants wanted her to rest, to recover from her injuries, but she refused. She had 1 week. She could not waste a single moment. She started with the prohibition itself. Every Valenthi child learned about it from the time they were born. The royal bloodline was sacred, blessed by the ancient gods who had created the universe. To touch that bloodline with unclean hands was to corrupt something divine. The law had existed for as long as anyone could remember. But Saylara wanted to know more than what everyone remembered. She wanted to know when it started and why. The first few days were frustrating. The official records all said the same thing. The prohibition was ancient, sacred, eternal. It had always existed. It would always exist. There was nothing more to know. But Saylara kept digging. She searched through older and older records, going back through the centuries like a miner digging through rock. And on the 4th day, she found something. It was a small entry in a medical journal from 12,000 years ago. The journal belonged to a physician who had served the imperial family during something called the Plague Era. Saylara had never heard of the Plague Era. It was not mentioned in any of the history texts she had studied as a child. She requested all records from that time period. The archivists brought her boxes of documents, scrolls, and data crystals. Most were damaged or incomplete. But piece by piece, Saylara began to understand. 12,000 years ago, the Valanthi had encountered something terrible. During their first great expansion into the galaxy, they had made contact with a species that no longer existed. These creatures carried parasites in their skin, tiny organisms that could transfer from one being to another through physical touch. The parasites were deadly to Valanthi, especially to those of the royal bloodline. The plague had spread quickly. Entire worlds had been quarantined. Millions had died. The royal family had been hit hardest of all. The emperor of that time had lost his wife, 3 of his children, and most of his council to the infection. In desperation, the surviving rulers had made a decision. They declared that all physical contact between royalty and outsiders was forbidden. Not because royalty was divine, but because they were vulnerable. The parasites could only spread through touch, so touch was banned. But they could not simply tell their people the truth. The Valanthi had been devastated by the plague. Their confidence, their belief in their own superiority, had been shattered. The rulers feared that if their people knew the royal family could be killed so easily by a simple touch, they would lose faith entirely. So they wrapped the ban in religious language. They called the royal bloodline sacred and divine. They said that outside touch was contamination, corruption, and offense against the gods themselves. And they punished violations with death, not because the punishment was just, but because fear was the only way to ensure absolute obedience. The plague had ended within a few centuries. The parasites had gone extinct when their host species died out. But by then, the prohibition had become tradition. Each new generation accepted it without question. The true reason was forgotten, buried in archives that no one bothered to read. For 10,000 years, the Valanthi had been killing innocents for a crime that no longer existed. Saylara sat alone in the archives for a long time after she finished reading. The data crystals glowed softly around her, holding secrets that had been hidden for millennia. She thought about all the beings who had been executed for touching royalty. Servants who had stumbled, children who had not understood, outsiders who had tried to help, just like Daniel Carter. All of them dead. All of them innocent. She gathered the evidence and went to see her father. The emperor's private chambers were simple compared to the grandeur of the throne room. Thalvaros sat by a window, looking out at the city below. He looked tired, older than Saylara had ever seen him. "You found something," he said without turning around. "Yes." Saylara placed the data crystals on the table beside him. Everything is here. The original medical records, the council debates, the decision to create the religious explanation. All of it. Thalvaros picked up one of the crystals and turned it over in his long fingers. I suspected something like this existed, he said quietly. When I was young, I asked questions about the prohibition. My father told me to stop asking. He said some truths were better left buried. He was wrong, Saylara said. We have been wrong for 10,000 years. We have killed innocent people to protect ourselves from a danger that no longer exists. The Emperor finally looked at her. His metal eyes were heavy with something she had not seen in him before. Doubt, uncertainty, maybe even shame. If I release the human, he said slowly, I must explain why. I must reveal the truth about the prohibition. Our people have believed in this law for longer than recorded history. It is the foundation of our entire social structure. If I tell them it was all a lie, what will happen? Will they lose faith in everything? Will the empire fall apart? Or they will learn, Saylara said. They will learn that our ancestors were afraid, just like any other species. They will learn that we made mistakes, and they will learn that we can be brave enough to correct those mistakes, even after all this time. She knelt beside her father and took his hand in hers. It was a gesture that would have been unthinkable between royalty and a commoner. But between father and daughter, it was simply love. The human did not know our laws, she said. He only knew that I was dying, and he could save me. He put his hands on my wound, and he held me together until his medic could heal me. He risked his life for a stranger. Is that not exactly the kind of quality we should admire? Thalvaros looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he looked out the window at his city, at his world, at the empire that had been built on fear and lies. The trial is in 3 days, he said finally. I will consider what you have shown me. I will consider everything. Saylara nodded and stood to leave. At the door, she paused. He is a good person, father. I could see it in his eyes. Whatever you decide, please remember that. She left the Emperor alone with his thoughts and his ancient secrets. And somewhere in a cell, on the other side of the palace, Daniel Carter sat and waited, not knowing that his fate rested on the conscience of a man who had just learned that everything he believed was wrong. The day of the trial arrived with all the ceremony the Volanthi could provide. The throne room was filled beyond capacity. Every noble family had sent representatives. Every military commander, every religious leader, every important person in the empire was there to witness the judgment. Outside the palace, millions more watched through broadcast screens. The trial was being transmitted to every Volanthi world, every ship, every outpost in the galaxy. This was not just about one human who had broken the law. This was about the most sacred tradition in their entire civilization. Daniel Carter was brought into the chamber in chains. They were ceremonial chains, made of silver and crystal, but they were heavy enough to remind him of his position. He was a criminal here, a violator of holy law, and the entire empire wanted to see him punished. He walked slowly down the long aisle between the rows of silent courtiers. Their eyes followed him, thousands of pale Volanthi faces, watching with expressions that ranged from anger to curiosity to cold indifference. Daniel kept his head up and his back straight. Whatever was going to happen, he would face it with dignity. At the front of the chamber, a small group of humans had been allowed to observe. Ambassador Laura Bennett was there, her face tight with worry. Beside her stood her aide, Chris Hawkins, a young man with nervous eyes who kept looking around at the alien crowd. They had come from the nearest human outpost as soon as they heard about Daniel's situation. But they had no power here. They could only watch. Daniel was brought to the center of the room and made to kneel. The chains forced his arms behind his back, and the hard floor pressed against his knees. He looked up at the throne where Emperor Thalvaros sat in perfect stillness. His name was Counselor Marin, and he was old even by Valanthi standards. He had served the imperial court for 500 years, and he had never lost a case. "The charges are as follows," Marin began, his voice carrying through the silent chamber. "The accused, a human known as Daniel Carter, did willfully and deliberately place his hands upon the sacred body of Princess Selara Vethani. He did contaminate her divine blood with his touch. He did violate the prohibition that has protected our people since the beginning of time." Marin paused and looked at Daniel with cold eyes. "The evidence is clear. The accused himself has admitted to the act. He has offered no defense except to say that he was trying to save the princess's life. This is irrelevant. The law does not consider intention. The law considers only the act, and the act was committed." He turned to face the emperor. "The punishment for this crime has been the same for 12,000 years. Molecular dispersal. Complete atomic dissolution. I ask the court to carry out this sentence immediately." The chamber was silent. Daniel could feel his heart beating in his chest, slow and steady despite everything. He had accepted this possibility from the moment he put his hands on the princess's wound. He did not regret it. He would not regret it. Then the emperor rose from his throne. The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. Thalvaros descended the steps slowly, his silver robes trailing behind him like water. He walked past the prosecutor, past the guards, until he stood directly in front of Daniel. "I will speak," the emperor said. No one dared to object. No one dared to move. "For 12,000 years, we have held to the prohibition as sacred truth. My father believed it. His father believed it. Every emperor back to the founding of our civilization believed it." Thalvaros paused and looked around at his people. "I believed it." He reached into his robes and pulled out a small data crystal. He held it up so everyone could see. 3 days ago, my daughter brought me evidence. Evidence that changes everything we thought we knew about our most sacred law. Evidence that was buried in our archives for 10,000 years, forgotten by everyone, because no one dared to question what they had been taught. He activated the crystal, and a holographic display appeared above it. Records, documents, medical reports from the ancient plague era, the truth that had been hidden for millennia. "The prohibition was never sacred," Thalvaros said. "It was never divine. It was created out of fear during a time of crisis to protect our people from a plague that no longer exists. Our ancestors wrapped it in religious language because they were afraid that the truth would destroy our civilization." The chamber erupted in shocked voices. Courtiers turned to each other, arguing, protesting, denying what they were hearing. The prosecutor looked like he had been struck across the face. "Silence," the emperor commanded, and silence fell. "I have spent 3 days thinking about what to do with this knowledge. I could have buried it again. I could have let this human die for a law that was built on lies. It would have been the easy thing to do, the traditional thing." He looked down at Daniel. "But this man did something that none of us were able to do. He saved my daughter's life. He put his hands on her wound and held her together while his medic worked. He knew our law. He knew the punishment. And he did it anyway, because he could not stand by and watch someone die." Thalvaros extended his hand toward Daniel. Every person in the chamber, every Valanthi watching on every world across the galaxy, saw what happened next. The High Emperor of the Valanthi people reached down and offered his hand to a human prisoner. "Stand," the Emperor said. Daniel hesitated for only a moment. Then he let the guards unlock his chains, and he reached up and took the Emperor's hand. The grip was firm, warm, alive. Daniel rose to his feet and stood face to face with the most powerful being in the Valanthi Empire. "The trial is concluded," Thalvaros announced. "The human is innocent. There is no crime because there is no contamination. The prohibition will be amended. From this day forward, sacred blood is not corrupted by compassion. It is honored by it. The chamber exploded into chaos. Some cried out in outrage, refusing to accept what they had witnessed. Others stood in stunned silence, trying to understand how everything they had believed could change in a single moment. A few, scattered throughout the crowd, began to nod slowly, accepting the truth that their emperor had revealed. Ambassador Bennett had tears in her eyes. Chris Hawkins was openly weeping, and Princess Saylara, standing at the edge of the crowd where she had been watching, smiled. Daniel still held the emperor's hand. He could feel the weight of history in that grip, the breaking of 10,000 years of tradition. He could feel the beginning of something new. "Thank you," he said quietly. Falveros looked at him with those metal eyes that had seen so many centuries pass. "No," the emperor replied. "Thank you for reminding us what we had forgotten, that compassion is never a crime." He released Daniel's hand and turned to face his people. "This is not the end," he announced. "This is a beginning, a new era for our people. We will learn from this, we will grow from this, and we will never again let fear make us forget what it means to be worthy of the stars." The broadcast ended, but the conversations that followed would last for generations. 1 year had passed since the trial that changed the galaxy. Daniel Carter stood on a balcony overlooking the capital city of Velen Prime. The sun was setting, painting the crystal towers in shades of gold and purple. Below him, the streets were filled with Velanthi going about their lives, but things were different now. The fear that had shaped their society for thousands of years was slowly beginning to fade. The year had not been easy. The Emperor's revelation had split the Velanthi people in ways that were still being felt. Traditionalist factions had formed, demanding a return to the old laws. Some nobles had refused to accept the truth, calling the ancient records forgeries created to justify a human's crime. There had been protests, debates, and even a few small uprisings in the outer colonies. But there had also been change. Real, lasting change. For the first time in recorded history, Velanthi diplomats shook hands with representatives from other species. For the first time, Velanthi doctors worked side by side with human medical teams, sharing knowledge that had been kept separate for millennia. Young Velanthi traveled to human worlds as students and tourists, experiencing cultures that their grandparents would have considered beneath their notice. The empire was not falling apart, as some had feared. It was growing. It was learning. It was becoming something new. Daniel had been offered many rewards for his role in all of this. The Velanthi Council had wanted to give him land, titles, wealth. The Earth's Space Corps had wanted to promote him to admiral. Media companies from a dozen species had wanted to make him famous, to tell his story across the galaxy. He had declined all of it. He was just a man who had done what he thought was right in a difficult moment. He wanted to get back to his ship, back to his crew, back to the simple work of exploring the stars. But before he could leave, there was one more meeting he had to have. Princess Saylara found him on the balcony as the last light of the sun disappeared behind the crystal towers. She walked differently now than she had a year ago. The wound from the attack had healed completely, leaving no physical scars. But there were other changes too. She carried herself with more confidence, more purpose. She had found her place in the universe, and it was not in the shadows of the archives. "You are leaving tomorrow," she said. It was not a question. "My ship is ready," Daniel replied. "Katie has been running things in my absence, but she is eager to give command back to me. She says paperwork is not her specialty." Saylara smiled. It was a real smile, warm and genuine. A year ago, Daniel had not believed Velanthi could smile like that. Now he knew better. "I wanted to thank you before you go," she said. "Not for saving my life. I have already thanked you for that many times. I wanted to thank you for something else. What is that? For being stubborn, she laughed softly. When you were in that cell, waiting for your trial, anyone else would have been terrified. Anyone else would have begged for mercy, made excuses, tried to blame the situation on circumstances beyond their control. But you did not. You stood in front of my father and the entire empire and said that you would not apologize for saving a life. You made us think. You made us question. She looked out at the city, at the world that was slowly transforming around them. My people needed someone to show us that our traditions were not perfect, that our laws were not divine, that change was possible, even after thousands of years. You did it by accident, by just being who you are, but you did it. Daniel was quiet for a moment. He thought about all the things that had happened since that day on the damaged cruiser. He thought about the blood on his hands, the chains on his wrists, the Emperor's grip as he helped him stand. He thought about the path that had brought him here, to this balcony, on this alien world, talking with a princess who had become something like a friend. I did not mean to change anything, he finally said. I just saw someone who needed help. That is exactly why it worked, Saylara replied. You were not trying to prove a point or make a political statement. You were just being human. And humans, I have learned, have a remarkable ability to change things simply by doing what seems right to them. She reached into her robes and pulled out a small device. It was a communication badge, similar to the ones used by Volanthi military officers, but with a different symbol on its surface. Two hands clasped together, one clearly Volanthi, and one clearly human. The Galactic Concord has formally proposed a joint exploration initiative, she said. Human and Volanthi ships working together, exploring regions of space that neither of our peoples has reached before. My father has asked me to lead the Volanthi delegation. She held out the badge. I requested you specifically as the human liaison. Daniel looked at the badge, then at Saylara. You want me to help lead a Volanthi fleet? I want you to help bridge two civilizations, she corrected. You have already done it once by accident. Imagine what we could accomplish if we did it on purpose. He took the badge and turned it over in his hand. It was light, almost weightless, but it felt like it held the weight of worlds. My crew might have some questions about this, he said. They are welcome to join us. Lieutenant Morris has already expressed interest. She sent me a message last week asking about Volanthi navigation systems. Your medic, Nathan, has been corresponding with our medical academy about human nanite technology. And your engineer, Ryan, has apparently made several friends among our ship designers. Daniel laughed. He should have known his crew would find ways to get involved. When do we start? He asked. Saylara's smile widened. We already have. 6 months later, the first joint human Volanthi exploration fleet launched from Volan Prime. Daniel Carter stood on the bridge of the flagship, the Unity, a ship designed by engineers from both species and crewed by officers who had learned to work together despite their differences. Beside him stood Princess Saylara, now officially designated as Fleet Commander. Around them, humans and Volanthi worked side by side, their hands moving across shared consoles, their voices calling out readings and reports in a mixture of languages that was slowly becoming something new. The stars stretched out before them, endless and unknown. Course laid in, Commander, Katie Morris reported from the navigation station. We are ready to go. Daniel looked at Saylara. She nodded. Take us out, he said. The fleet moved forward into the darkness between the stars, into a future that no one could have predicted. Behind them, two civilizations watched and waited, hoping that this experiment in cooperation would succeed. Years later, historians would write about this moment. They would call it the beginning of the Great Alliance, the partnership that would shape the galaxy for centuries to come. They would analyze the political decisions, the cultural shifts, the economic impacts. But those who were there, those who lived through it, knew that it had all started with something much simpler. It had started with a man who saw someone dying and refused to stand by and do nothing. It had started with a touch, and that touch had changed everything. The stars outside the viewport were cold and distant. Commander Daniel Carter stood on the bridge of his ship, the horizon's edge, watching the endless darkness of space stretch before him. His crew had been traveling through the outer rim of the Orion Nebula for 3 weeks now, mapping uncharted regions and collecting scientific data. It was quiet work, peaceful work, and Daniel liked it that way. He was a tall man with tired eyes and graying hair at his temples. 15 years in the Earth Space Corps had taught him patience and caution. He had seen enough strange things in the galaxy to know that surprises were rarely good ones. "Commander, we have something," said Lieutenant Katie Morris from her station. She was young, barely 26, with sharp eyes and quick fingers that danced across her console. "I am picking up a distress signal. It is weak, but it is definitely there." Daniel walked over to her station and looked at the screen. The signal was coming from a ship drifting about 2 hours away at standard speed. The vessel's energy signature was fading, which meant it was losing power fast. "Can you identify the ship?" Daniel asked. Katie worked her console for a moment. Her face changed when she saw the result. "It is Volanthi, sir. A royal cruiser, by the look of it." The bridge went quiet. Everyone knew about the Volanthi. They were one of the oldest species in the Galactic Concord, and they were also one of the most difficult to deal with. They considered themselves superior to almost every other race in the galaxy, especially humans. To them, humans were young, primitive creatures who had only recently crawled out of their little blue planet. But the thing everyone knew most about the Volanthi was their most sacred law: never touch their royalty. Their ruling class was considered divine, blessed by ancient gods that the Volanthi still worshipped. If an outsider touched a member of the royal family, it was considered contamination of sacred blood. The punishment was death, always and without exception. "Are there life signs?" Daniel asked. Katie nodded slowly. 3, but 2 are fading fast. The third is critical. They do not have much time, Commander. Daniel thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. A distress signal was a distress signal. He did not care if they were Volanthi, or human, or anything else. People were dying, and he had the power to help them. "Set a course," he said, "maximum speed, and get Nathan and Ryan to meet me at the shuttle bay." Nathan Cole was the ship's chief medic. He was a calm man in his 30s, with steady hands and a gentle voice. Ryan Torres was the head engineer, a large man with a thick beard and arms covered in old scars from years of working with dangerous machinery. They were 2 of the best people Daniel had ever served with, and he trusted them completely. The 3 of them took a small shuttle across to the Volanthi cruiser. As they got closer, Daniel could see the damage. The ship had been attacked. Plasma burns covered the hull, and several sections had been torn open by weapons fire. Whoever had done this had been thorough. They docked with the ship through an emergency airlock. The interior was dark, except for flickering emergency lights. Smoke filled the corridors, and the smell of burning metal hung heavy in the air. Daniel led the way with his weapon drawn, though he did not expect to find any attackers still aboard. They found the first 2 Volanthi near the command deck. Both were guards, judging by their armor. They were dead, their pale blue skin torn by shrapnel and burns. Nathan checked them quickly and shook his head. There was nothing to be done. "The third life sign is this way," Ryan said, checking his scanner. "Through that door." The door led to a central chamber, probably private quarters for someone important. The room was a mess of broken glass, scattered furniture, and sparking electronics. And in the middle of it all, lying in a pool of glowing blue blood, was a Volanthi woman. She was young, Or at least she looked young. Valanthe lived for many centuries, so it was hard to tell their true age. Her hair was silver, spreading around her head like water, and her skin had a faint shimmer to it, even in the dim light. She wore fine robes that were now soaked with blood, and a piece of jagged metal stuck out from her side. "That is royal clothing," Ryan whispered. "Commander, I think she is a princess or something." Daniel did not care about her title. He cared about the blood spreading across the floor and the way her breathing was getting weaker by the second. "Nathan, what do we have?" he asked. Nathan knelt beside her, running his medical scanner over her body. His face was grim. "Massive internal bleeding. The metal went deep. She has maybe 4 minutes, Commander, maybe less." 4 minutes. Not enough time to get her back to their ship. Not enough time for anything complicated. "What do you need?" Daniel asked. "I need to stabilize the wound and inject emergency nanites. But I need someone to apply pressure while I work. Direct pressure, right here." Nathan pointed to the area around the metal shard. Daniel dropped to his knees without hesitation. He placed his hands on the wound, pressing down firmly while Nathan prepared his equipment. The princess's blood was warm and wet against his fingers. It glowed faintly, like liquid starlight. He did not think about the Valanthe laws. He did not think about the sacred prohibition against touching royalty. He did not think about the fact that what he was doing could get him executed. He only thought about keeping this woman alive long enough for Nathan to save her. "Hold steady," Nathan said, working quickly. "The nanites need 30 seconds to reach the damaged tissue." Daniel held steady. He could feel the princess's heartbeat through the wound, weak but still fighting. She was not ready to die. He was not going to let her. Behind them, Ryan suddenly spoke. "Commander, we have a problem." Daniel looked up. Through the shattered viewport of the chamber, he could see lights approaching. Another ship. No, several ships. A whole fleet of them, all bearing the golden symbols of the Valanthe Empire. "The Royal Rescue Party," Ryan said quietly. "They must have gotten the same distress signal." Daniel looked down at his hands, covered in the princess's sacred blood, pressed against her sacred body. He looked at Nathan, who had just finished the injection and was now sealing the wound with medical gel. "She is going to live," Nathan said. "The nanites are working. She is stable." That was good news. That was great news. But Daniel knew that when those Valanthe ships docked, and those Valanthe soldiers came aboard, and saw a human with his hands on their dying princess, the great news was going to become very bad news very quickly. He did not move his hands. The wound was not fully sealed yet, and he was not going to risk her life to save his own. "Let them come," Daniel said quietly. "We did the right thing." Ryan and Nathan exchanged looks, but said nothing. Once he made a decision, he did not back down from it. The Valanthe ships grew closer, and Daniel Carter waited with the blood of a princess on his hands, and the weight of an ancient law about to fall on his shoulders.